Hi guys! I hope that you enjoyed the first two chapters of our book Flat Stanley. Today I'm going to read just one chapter because it's a little longer, and then we'll post the other ones later on. Alright, so chapter 3, I showed you a sneak peek in the last video, is called Stanley the Kite. Here we go. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park. But it was difficult when they were crossing a street or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from side to side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked walking. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to, and it made him mad. One Sunday afternoon in the street, they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's. "Well, George, I see you've brought some wallpaper," Mr. Jones said. "Going to decorate your house?" "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh, no, this is my son, Stanley." He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young feller," the man said. "George," he said to Mr. Lambchop, "that boy is flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lambchop said. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my younger son, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said, "and he will apologize for his rudeness." Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard when they were on their way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica on top of himself. An encyclopedia is a very, very big book that has a bunch of information on a lot of different things. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me." Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke of Stanley. "Arthur can't help but be jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother, after all." The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny, but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, huge kites with long tails, made in all the colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I will have a big kite, and I will win a kite flying contest and be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. "You can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways to get up speed, and then turned up to meet the breeze. Up, 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 up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on those gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from side to side when he wanted speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind carefully a little at a time so that it wouldn't get a hold of him, and then he would slip gracefully down toward the earth again. Whoa, look at him, up above everybody else. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long matched swoops. He held his arms by his side and zoomed at the ground like a rocket, curved up towards the sun. His side slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody had ever flown that way. Stanley Lambchop flew that day, and probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running. Stanley went right on, though, just showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He didn't notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind was blowing the string and it got tangled in a tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley didn't realize until leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross. Cross means mad. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day, having fun," she said. "You don't realize what I go through with these boys. They're very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "Phases. Be patient, dear." All right, so that's the end of chapter 3. And chapter 4 is really long, so I'm going to post it in a little bit. It's called The Museum Thieves. All right, hope you guys have enjoyed, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.